Hey everyone, Tactics here with more Season 4 content, where in this video I'll be going through ULDAMAN, the Legacy of Tyr, discussing important trash and boss abilities, as well as changes to the dungeon from PTR testing. If you want to see a full list of all of the trash abilities or are interested in a pug-friendly route to start out the season, make sure you check out my ability spreadsheet, my pug route video, or my written guides for the method website, all linked in the description below. Otherwise, let's get started with just a short mention of the profession bonus in the dungeon, available to players with the mining profession as well as the mole machine checkpoint. So basically, there are 3 crumbling rock veins in set positions in the first half of the dungeon, which players that have at least 25 skill in Dragon Isles mining can interact with to reveal a lost tome of Tyr, which just gives players a stacking 10% out of combat move speed bonus. Not massive, but it definitely can feel very nice in this totally indoor dungeon. If you want to know the exact locations, I've marked them in the MDT string in my pug-friendly video, so go check that out. In terms of checkpoints, you'll always respawn at the start of the dungeon, but you'll find a mole machine that you can interact with just in front of you here that will take you to various parts of the dungeon once you've killed or just even pulled certain bosses. There's one after you defeat Bromach, as well as one before both Emberon and Chrono-Lord Deios that you'll be able to go to after you pull them once. Now, with that discussed, let's move on to the trash at the start of the dungeon, which is very trog heavy, and one of the more important ones is going to be the Stone Vault Geomancers. Their important ability is Chain Lightning. This, as expects, is a lightning hit that will chain to other players, so interrupt or use a CC to stop this cast. The other really spooky mob in this area are the Vicious Basilisks. They have a nasty tank hit in Chomp, which applies a stacking bleed that can get out of hand quickly, so make sure tanks, you're aware of this, use defensives as needed, and bleed cleanses are very good in this dungeon as a whole, not just this area as well. The important cast they have is Spiked Carapace. Again, interrupt or stop this ability because it will actually reflect damage back to players that hit them, and this can get very scary in higher keys, so make sure this doesn't go off, and if it does go off by accident, use a purge of some kind to remove that magic effect quickly before players deal too much damage to themselves. In a cavern off of the main path, you'll find the first boss of the dungeon, the Lost Dwarves, who each have a couple abilities to be aware of. Balog has a frontal in Wild Cleave, as well as a line attack in Heavy Arrow, so be sure that tanks are facing this guy away from your group, and once that Heavy Arrow cast starts, make sure you step out of the way because it will not follow you. Olaf targets a random player with ricocheting shield, so make sure this person uses a defensive. Otherwise, just make sure you interrupt him as quickly as possible when he starts to channel defensive bulwark just to get that buff off quickly. Eric the Swift will just spam dagger throw for some additional random damage throughout the fight, and will also occasionally jump at a random player with Skullcracker, so just avoid that swirly. When any of the bosses reaches 100 energy or 10% health, they'll jump into the longboat and begin channeling Searing Cannon Fire, with this firing faster for each additional dwarf in the boat. Make sure to avoid the puddles that spawns here, and healers be ready for the pulsing damage caused by Fiery Surge at the same time. I recommend just cleaving these guys down evenly, and in terms of positioning, just stay grouped as best you can, moving between frontal casts if Eric ends up jumping somewhere out of range. Continuing down the main path, you'll eventually run into the second boss, Bromach, who will intermittently spawn more Trog trash mobs that you fought in the previous area. Tanks should be sure to get aggro on these mobs, and you want to make sure, again, you don't let that Geomancer get the Chain Lightning cast off. To make grouping a little easier here, I recommend having a ranged DPS just kick the first Geomancer cast no matter what it is, just so it walks in initially and can be picked up easily by the tank and it doesn't just stay out of range spam casting. The main damage intake on this fight comes from the Quaking Totems. These deal constant shocking quake damage to the entire group. You want to make sure you're using defensives and healing CDs here to keep everyone alive, and make sure you are swapping this totem quickly and killing it as fast as you can. When it dies, it triggers a tremor on the mobs within its circle, giving you a nice damage amp to finish off any remaining Trog, so you don't need to worry about actually focusing them down until this happens. Ideally, you kill this totem either before or shortly after the boss casts Bloodlust, just so you don't need to worry about the extra damage this brings. Outside of that, the boss does a Thundering Slam AoE around himself just throughout the encounter, so make sure you step away when this happens. From there, you'll be able to go further into the actual vault itself, and there are a couple new mobs to be aware of. The Earthen Custodians are another frontal mob. They just have a cleave. This targets the tank. It deals some extra physical damage as well, which isn't scary on its own for tanks, but it can be scary if you pull a lot of these guys, so be aware of that, and just make sure they're always faced away from your group. The Refty Custodians are big snake mobs in this area, and they will gain a stacking damage buff and ancient power over time, which can be quite scary for tanks as it can lead to things one-shotting them even with just a regular attack. So you want to make sure you stun them to remove these stacks and trigger systemic vulnerability, giving a 50% damage increase at the same time. These mobs also have Jagged Bite, which is another bleed attack at the tank, but no, you can continuously kind of back up out of range of these mobs whenever they try and cast this ability on you, and it won't successfully cast. It won't put the ability on cooldown, but they'll keep trying to cast it, and you can just continuously step backwards and step backwards throughout this hallway to just avoid that damage entirely. Earthen Weavers are also in this area, and they have an important stop in Hail of Stone. This just channels AoE nature damage for 6 seconds, so you want to make sure you use some sort of CC to prevent this cast from going off. As you make your way deeper into the dungeon, you'll find Sentinel Talondras, who is a bit of a unique boss, as she can actually be stunned, which will reset her energy. On pull, and anytime she does get stunned, she'll gain the Inexorable buff, making her immune to the next 2 stuns cast on her, and also gaining a stack of Unrelenting, increasing all damage she does by 5%, meaning you don't actually want to just chain stun this boss, otherwise her damage just gets out of hand. In terms of what her abilities actually do, throughout the fight, she'll target 2 players with Resonating Orb, which will spawn underneath them and activate after a short delay, stunning anyone that touches it after activation, including the boss, so you can actually use this to clear Inexorable stacks or even stun the boss if those are already removed. A total of 3 of these will spawn, again 2 of those are on random players, and then 1 additionally spawns randomly throughout the room. So to reduce movement here, you can actually have the 2 targeted players stack up on top of each other and drop the 2 orbs in one spot so that you can just move through it, and that instantly clears 2 Inexorable stacks in one sweep. Earthen Shards is a very dangerous single target hit here. It leaves behind a nasty bleed on the target as well, so you want to make sure if you are targeted by this, you're using defensives or a bleed cleanse if you have it available, especially when it overlaps with the Crushing Stomp AoE hit and knockback. You also want to be aware when this ability goes out, because you can get knocked back into one of those Resonating Orbs, which is very bad. At 100 energy, Talondras will start to cast Titanic Empowerment, which if successful will make her immune to CC and increase her damage done by 50% for 20 seconds, which likely results in a wipe. That means you want to make sure you are stunning her before this cast finishes, so I recommend using the Resonating Orbs to remove the 2 Inexorable stacks from her, and then when that Empowerment cast actually starts, just have a stun ability ready to use and interrupt the cast. If you don't have one available, you can always use the 3rd Resonating Orb to actually trigger that stun. Just note that you may want to start this movement a little bit before 100 energy, because sometimes the boss moves a little bit slowly. Moving past this area, there are some more Earthen. A big one is the Earthen Warder. This guy's got Curse of Stone, which targets a random player, and as expected, it curses them and will eventually petrify them and deal a big hit around them. So you want to make sure you interrupt or stop this cast with a CC, and if one does go out, use a Curse spell to quickly remove it. Runic Protectors are golems in this area, and they have a nasty tank hit in Fissuring Slam. There's a nature hit on the tank that also spawns a puddle beneath all 5 players that increases your physical damage taken while you're inside it, so make sure you get out of those puddles. 1, of course, the tank is taking melee damage, which is physical, but 2, this mob also channels Earthquake, which is ticking physical damage over 6 seconds. It's heavy ticking damage too, so you want to, again, make sure you're out of those puddles so you don't take additional damage, and you're using defensives and healing CDs here to survive. There's also beasts in this area. The important one is the Cavern Seeker Bats. These guys will cast Sonic Burst, which is a big physical hit, and 3-second silence, so make sure you are interrupting or stopping this cast with a CC. From there, you'll be able to take on Emberon, which rotates between a boss phase and an intermission phase. At the start of the boss phase, 4 of the inactive keepers around the room will become activated, remaining untargetable but shooting Seeking Flame Tornadoes at random players for the duration of the phase. So be aware of these and make sure you are avoiding them. The boss also has a tank frontal in Searing Clap, so tanks, make sure you're pointing this away from your group and using a defensive for the hit. When this frontal does actually go off, it also applies the Burning Heat magic dot to the entire group, which now is only a 6-second duration, down from 10, so use any available magic dispels you have, and healers otherwise be ready to heal through that ticking damage. For boss positioning, I recommend tanking near a wall but away from any active keepers, just to give you and your group some time to actually avoid those tornadoes while still being able to point that frontal away harmlessly into the wall. Outside of that, the boss will occasionally mark players with unstable embers, causing them to explode in a 7-yard AoE after a few seconds, so make sure you are loosely spread and be ready to use a defensive if this ever overlaps in any way with the Searing Clap cast. When this boss reaches full energy, they run to the center of the room and become immune to damage and begin channeling purging flames, creating a massive fire line that cuts the room in half and slowly rotates clockwise around the room. At the same time, you'll be taking constant ticking damage from the heat engine, so you want to make sure that your party ends up in the same half of the room so you are in range of your healer. To get out of this phase, you need to kill the now targetable keepers that were shooting at you in the previous boss phase. Once that's done, the boss shield will drop and you'll repeat the initial phase again. Once you get past Emberon, there's another golem mob to be aware of. These are the Ebonstone golems, and they have a hit in Thunderous Clap. Unlike the Earthquake we mentioned before, this is a single big hit, and it can actually be line of sighted, which in a lot of higher fortified keys, you'll want to do with the hallways or pillars or anything like that to actually get away and dodge this hit entirely. So be aware of that. Potentially tank in spots where you can line of sight this hit. There's more Earthern as well in the Earthern Guardian. This guy's main cast is Blessing of Tyr. It'll just stand still and channel and create this orb around itself, which boosts other mobs in the area's damage by 20% and also deals damage to any players in the area. So you want to make sure you stay out of this bubble, and tanks as well. Try and get mobs out of that bubble so they don't get that damage amp. Just before the last boss, you'll find some infinite dragons, and the big one is infinite time reavers. These guys stack up stolen time on all players. This is a magic dot that also reduces your haste by 2% per stack, so you want to use any magic dispels you can to remove it. But again, line of sight will actually prevent this from applying to you, so if you ever need to drop your stacks for any reason, you can just step out behind a pillar or behind a corner and you can drop your stacks that way. That brings us to the final boss of the dungeon, Chrono-Lord Deios, where the main mechanic are the Eternity Orbs spawned throughout the fight. These orbs cost the boss 20 energy to create and will slowly fall from the sky and grow into an Eternity Zone that you'll want to avoid. These are baited on player position, so you'll want to stay relatively close together and slowly rotate around the room to conserve as much space as possible. When the boss reaches 0 energy, he casts Rewind Time Flow, causing these zones to now shrink and float upwards instead of down, giving you a massive 50% haste buff at the same time. So when this happens, you actually want to do the opposite and jump into those puddles for a nice damage boost, and saving CDs here, especially ones that benefit from haste, can actually be a nice damage boost. Outside of that, 3 players will occasionally get the Time Sync Magic Dot, which can also be cleared with any movement freeing effect since it's a slow. So if you have access to additional dispels or clears, be sure to get rid of this dot as quickly as possible to reduce your damage intake and then avoid the Time Eruption swirly it spawns under your feet. This dot can get especially scary when it overlaps with the Wing Buffet hit, so use a personal if this ever happens, and be aware this hit also knocks you back, so try and avoid getting knocked into one of those Eternity Zones. For tanks, this boss will use the Sand Breath Frontal, and this hits quite hard, so make sure not only is this pointed away from your group, but you also use a defensive for every single hit, calling for externals if needed. But that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully it helped you out, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like it. As always, thank you to my amazing Patreons for all of your support. It really does mean a lot to me, and I'll see everyone in the next video.